This lecture will explain the player class. As I mentioned earlier, the player class supports the playback of media files. The player class can play audio or video files on local storage devices and play audio or video streams saved on the server. In addition, the player class provides basic media player functions, such as the play, pause, stop, and resume functions. Also, the class provides additional time-based seeking, volume control, and looping functions. This player class has been created to support applications such as the media player. Not only does bada provide the player class, it also provides the DRM class, that is, Digital Rights Management. The DRM class automatically identifies the rights management scheme, such as OMA or WMDRM, and enables the playback of the file in the appropriate way. The DRM manipulation functions of the DRM class belong to the DRM_content privilege group. Now, let's find out about the audio and video formats the player class supports. For video, the H.264, H.263, MPEG-4, and VC1 formats are supported. And for audio, the PCM, AMRNB, AAC, AAC+, EAAC+, MIDI, MP3, and WMA formats are all supported. Sometimes, depending on the application, more than one media file is required to be played simultaneously. For example, in a game, the sound effects and background music may be played at the same time. To support these cases, up to 10 player instances can be created at the same time. However, compressed audio files, and more specifically, all audio files except for PCM, can only be played one after the other. However, 2 or 3 uncompressed PCM audio files can be played at the same time, depending on the device. Now let's take a look at the player's state transitions when the player actually runs. If the player is constructed, the player is initialized. Then we have to open a media file. We can open a media file in either a synchronous or asynchronous way. If a file or stream is synchronously opened, the player directly enters the opened state. If a media is asynchronously opened, the onPlayerOpened listener function is called. In this state, if the playing function of the player is called, the player enters the playing state. In the playing state, the file can be stopped with the stop command or paused with the pause command. To return to the playing state, simply call the play function. There are 2 scenarios where the player is closed. The first is if no loop is set for the playing and the end of the media is reached, the onPlayerEndOfClip listener function is called. This listener function will close the player. The second is if you want to close the player before the end of the media file is reached. You can explicitly call the stop function for the media that's being played, and this will also close the player. As I mentioned earlier, if the player state changes, the player event listener's various listener functions are called. If a media file is opened, the onPlayerOpened function is called. If the playback is to be stopped to get the streaming data, the onPlayerBuffering function is called. If the end of the media file is reached, the onPlayerEndOfClip function is called. If a higher priority task needs to access the device required to play a media file, the onPlayerInterrupted function is called. And if the playback is finished, the onPlayerReleased function is called. If a problem occurs during the media playback, the onPlayerErrorOccurred function is called. If the user or program moves the playback to a specific position, the onPlayerSeekCompleted function is called to asynchronously notify the program that the playback is ready. Let's take a look at how we can actually use the player. In this example, we'll create a player for playing back videos. You can create an audio player in a similar way, except for a few points. But first, let's create a form-based application. Put the video file into the application resource of the application and add play and pause buttons to the form in order to control the playback. Finally, prepare the overlay panel where the actual video will be displayed. Then, create the listener object and implement the listener functions to perform the appropriate actions depending on the player state. Then, the following need to be implemented in the source code of the form. In the form, declare the player, panel, and listener object pointers as class member variables. Then, create the code to initialize the video player and create the code to delete the video player. Then you have to implement the event listeners for the buttons in order to control the player. Let's take a look at the initialization process and the form's event listener in more detail. In the form initialization process, we have to get the pointers to the two buttons and the pointer to the overlay panel. After that, we create the player and connect the overlay panel's background buffer and the player. Finally, we open a video file to finish the preparation for the playback. Since play and pause buttons are used in this example, the button event listeners should implement the functionality to start and pause the player. The figure that you're looking at here is the UI to be used in this example. The play and pause buttons are located at the top, and an overlay panel, which has the IDC_overlay ID, has been created at the bottom. Now let's look at the source code. The first code fragment is the event listener object. In the player event listener object, onPlayer opened, onPlayer end of clip, onPlayer buffering, onPlayer error occurred, onPlayer interrupted, onPlayer released, and onPlayer seek completed functions should all be declared. And a player pointer has been declared as a member. The player pointer is received as a parameter of the construct function of the listener object. So let's now implement the listener functions. The first function is onPlayer opened. Since this function is called when a media file is opened, this function prints a message stating that a file has been opened. The onPlayer end of clip function calls the stop function of the player. The onPlayer buffering is a dummy function. We also implement the onPlayer error occurred function as a dummy function. If the playback is interrupted by a higher priority task, the onPlayer interruption function is called. So in this function, we call the player's pause function. If the device is released, we will call the play function of the player. OnPlayer seek completed is also a dummy function because the function is not used in this example. This slide here shows the declarations of the form class. You can see the IDs assigned to the two buttons, and that the button pointer and overlay panel pointer are declared as member variables. The player event listener and player pointer are also declared as member variables. This slide shows the UI and player initialization procedures in the onInitializing function of the form. The two buttons are registered as subcontrols of the form. Their action IDs are set and the event listeners are specified. Then the overlay panel pointer is retrieved and the player is created. We get the buffer information from the background buffer info of the overlay panel. The buffer information and the listener object are then used in the player construct function to connect the player, the event listener, and the overlay panel. We then call the open file of the function with the path of the video file from the resource folder and the Boolean parameter set to true, and the player asynchronously opens the file. Finally, the volume level is set. If a file is asynchronously opened, the open file function returns immediately. And if the file is actually opened, the onPlayerOpen function of the listener object is called. This slide shows the onTerminating function of the form. In the onTerminating function, you have to delete all the objects you have allocated in the onInitializing function. In this example, the player is stopped, and the player and listener objects are all deleted. Finally, in the onActionPerformed function, if the play button is pressed, the play function of the player is called. And if the pause button is pressed, the pause function of the player is called. If you execute this code, this screen will be displayed.